Hi, welcome to this channel. I am wearing headphones because there's a lot of noise around me, and I'm really hoping and crossing my fingers that this is something that I'm going to be able to get rid of when I edit this video. I had planned on filming this video today, and I am really excited to share this type of videos in the future. So I'm kind of like allowing my excitement to do it without really thinking too much about the consequences, because I may have to do a lot of work when I'm editing. But this is my introduction to this new type of videos that I want to add to this channel. I have been inspired with all of the conversations that I've had with my guests in the podcast, The Way of the Heart. And I really want to share more about my own journey of self-exploration and my spiritual path. I have drawn from many different traditions to implement different practices in my day-to-day life. I love learning about it. I love reading and watching different sources of knowledge and schools of thought. And I love implementing that into my life and seeing how I feel about it and how everything resonates with me and the type of gifts that it gives to my life. And my hope is that with sharing that here, you can benefit from it. And this specific video has been inspired by a conversation that I had with Angie Pon. The name of our conversation is From Pain to Purpose. And there was a moment in the conversation in which she talked about epigenetics. And that is what has inspired this video today. Like I said, my practices and my own exploration with my spiritual journey and personal growth and development draws from different practices. I specifically feel very connected and I resonate a lot with Buddhist teachings. So today I'm actually going to be sharing one of the Buddhist teachings in which we can really see the connection with epigenetics. Another thing that I love to do is learning about the mind and the body in general. So science is also a source that has personally given me a lot of gratitude towards my body and appreciation. So I know spirituality and science can tend to fight a little bit, or there's a lot of resistance in integrating those two worlds. But the more I have explored myself, my journey into different traditions and science, the more I can see that those two overlap at some point. And there are so many things that I have gained from understanding the body that I think is a beautiful way to explore ourselves in this path. I don't consider myself an expert in these topics. I am just very curious and very passionate about learning about them. And because I feel so passionate, I also find myself really enjoying sharing this information and teaching others whenever they ask me about it. I figured this platform is a good way to kind of like put myself out there. And if there's anyone that is interested in learning more, you can use the comments here and let me know, and I will be more than happy to share more of these topics here. I am a mindfulness meditation teacher, and that was kind of like one of the main doors that really allowed me to see how much passion I had for all of these topics. And I think that mindfulness specifically was an amazing door for me to find and for my heart to guide me in that direction, because mindfulness is one of the meditation modalities that has been explored the most in the science world. So there's a lot of evidence to all of the benefits of mindfulness, which again, I find fascinating once I experience myself meditation and the many different practices and teachings. And then when I learn what is happening at the physiological level, I kind of like put two and two together and I connect the dots, and it's kind of like an explosion of aha moments at the same time. So in this video, I was inspired by that conversation with Angie in which she mentioned epigenetics, and that's basically where I want to start. So what is epigenetics? So epigenetics is basically the science that is showing us that depending on our lifestyle and our environment, we have the capacity to switch on or off different genes in our DNA. And this I find incredibly fascinating because contrary to what we have thought, which is basically that if there's any type of gene that is passed on through different generations in our families, we will most likely inherit an illness, for example. And epigenetics is actually showing us that we have personally a lot of influence on whether that gene is activated or not. And whenever I think about this, I also like to remind myself of something that comes from Buddhism, which is that as long as we are incarnated in this human body, death is inevitable and aging is inevitable. I know there's a lot of people out there that are fascinated by this idea of being immortal, and a lot of their work is doing that. And I personally find that fascinating as an outsider, just seeing how people explore that. But in my own view and perspective, I cannot necessarily defy nature. So aging is going to happen, death is going to happen. And I actually personally find that as painful as death is, I also see that there are so many beautiful things about it. And that is, of course, because I have a spiritual approach to that, which in different videos, I can definitely get into that. But we have the understanding of what epigenetics is. Now, what I want to talk about today and this teaching from Buddhism is the Four Nourishments. And before I get into that, before I get into explaining what these Four Nourishments are, I do want to mention or set a foundation for what the main teaching of Buddhism is, kind of like the big umbrella of the Buddhist teachings, where all of the other teachings kind of like branch out from. So this big umbrella teaching is the one on the Four Noble Truths. So what are these Four Noble Truths? So the first noble truth is telling us that suffering exists. So basically, as long as we are human beings, suffering is going to be part of this experience. Now, suffering is the translation to the Pali word dukkha. And dukkha is really more than suffering. It could be related to dissatisfaction and discomfort. So suffering, discomfort, dissatisfaction, it gives you an idea of what dukkha is pointing us to. What the noble truth is telling us is not only that suffering exists, but it's basically inviting us to do something. And the first invitation of this first noble truth is to understand suffering. So the second noble truth is that there must be a cause for suffering. And the invitation here is to explore where the suffering is coming from. And this is where the Four Nourishments are going to come into place and how it relates to epigenetics. The third noble truth is that cessation of suffering is possible. And the invitation here is to walk the path towards the cessation of suffering and to basically achieve well-being. The fourth noble truth is that there is a path to this cessation of suffering, to transform suffering into well-being. And this is the Eightfold Path. And the invitation here is to start walking this path. So there are 8 aspects to be explored, investigated, and practiced. And the first one of these aspects is right view. And this is the only one that I'm going to talk about. I'm not even going to mention the other 7. Right view is what I really want to focus on here. And before I do that, I do want to share with you the book that I am using as reference to share all of these teachings. This is The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings by Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh was a world-renowned Buddhist monk, and he has many different books that I find are so digestible, so easy to understand, and so relatable to our modern world. And I want to share with you a small quote or excerpt from this book that made me think about the connection between epigenetics and the Eightfold Path and right view specifically, and of course the Four Nourishments, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So it says, Venerable Shariputra added that right view is knowing which of the four kinds of nutriments that we have ingested have brought about what has come to be. So this is really what made me think about epigenetics and basically having the understanding that if there's suffering, of course, from the Buddhist perspective, we're seeing suffering as something more intangible. But the reality is that we have also learned with science that emotions and our internal state really affects our physical state and our well-being in general. So when I think about this, I think, well, what has come to be is related with what I'm ingesting, right? And this is where the teachings of the Four Nourishments or Nutriments come into play. So the Four Nourishments talk about these different foods that we are ingesting in different aspects of our life that are contributing to our well-being or to our suffering. And right view is the aspect of this Eightfold Path in which we can actually gain clarity of what is happening and what is bringing suffering to our lives. It also allows us to understand reality from a more objective perspective. I feel like many of us have already learned from lived experience or from different understandings from different traditions that the reality that we experience individually is coming from one specific perspective or angle, right? So basically, how I see my life, what I understand about my life is how I'm going to perceive my reality. However, when we are able to kind of like separate ourselves a little bit from the stories that we're telling ourselves, then we can get to a point of a more objective reality or understanding of a more objective reality. So this is basically what right view is inviting us to do and explore and to practice. And the Four Nourishments come into play here. So the first of the Four Nourishments or nutriments is edible foods. So edible foods is of course incredibly important for our well-being. Food is the main source of energy that we are ingesting. So whatever we're putting in our body in the form of food, that is what our body is processing and creating energy out of that. Now, the path of walking the way of the heart, which I have described before as this idea of peeling a lot of layers and unlearning and relearning things, requires a lot of energy. So when we are mindful and aware of the foods that we're ingesting and how they're contributing to our well-being and how much energy they are gifting us with, this, of course, becomes an incredible important aspect to understand ourselves and how we are contributing to our growth in general. Another thing that I would like to add here is that self-exploration and understanding ourselves is getting us closer every day to a more authentic version of ourselves. Basically, is inviting us to be more aligned with what is truly resonant to ourselves. And I want to give an example here with edible foods. I personally have made different choices throughout my life when it comes to the foods that I ingest based on what I have heard outside of myself that is going to be good for me. And that is because there are certain standards in society that I have learned or agreed on without knowing, unconsciously basically, that are telling me how I should look, right? So throughout my life, I made decisions that were not necessarily in alignment with what my body was requiring or what it needed. Instead, it was more to kind of like check a box of meeting a standard that was outside of myself. Now, this idea of edible foods and these teachings of the Four Nourishments really bring me into a reflection about my own well-being, right? So it is bringing me into alignment. It is allowing me to see clearly, which again, this is why these Four Nourishments are under this umbrella of right view in the Eightfold Path. It is allowing me to see things more objectively. And what I find about self-exploration is that it is not a linear path, and it is not a path to do perfect right away. We are exploring, we're adjusting as we go. So, what are we ingesting? How is this food nourishing us? How is this food contributing to our well-being? The second nourishment of these four foods is sense impressions. And this is talking about anything that our senses are basically ingesting. What are we feeding our senses? And I find this one to be extremely relevant for our days, our modern days. So this is pointing us towards what are we consuming? What type of books are we reading? What type of social media accounts are we following? What type of shows are we watching? What type of music even are we listening to? What are the lyrics saying? All of the things that we are allowing our senses to experience are leaving impressions in our consciousness. And we're going to talk about the fourth food, and all of this is going to kind of like overlap, and it's going to make even more sense as to how we can reflect on the type of foods that we're ingesting and how they're affecting us. So when we think about what we're consuming through our senses, this is also asking us things like, are we going outside? Are we allowing the sun to touch our skin? Are we communing with nature? Or are we always in an office? Are we always in front of our computers? This one is really inviting us to reflect in so many different aspects of our lives. And something that I'm thinking of is also another conversation that we had in the podcast with Emiliana Molina Fajardo, when I asked her about her relationship with the news. So if you haven't watched that video, she is a former White House correspondent, and she now has gone through her own journey of self-discovery. And today she has a very specific relationship with the news. And she shares in that conversation, if you want to listen to it, how she approaches the news. And of course, this is extremely relevant in today's world. It is important to stay informed. It's incredibly important to know what is happening in the world. But the reflection here is, how much of it are we consuming? And how is that affecting us? And how is it affecting our well-being? What type of impressions is this leaving in our consciousness? Where is it taking our attention, basically? Attention is very relevant here. How are we using, or where are we putting our attention? And as we know, where attention goes, energy flows. So once again, the idea of how is our energy relating to these foods and nourishments is coming up again here. I always love using analogies that are related to nature. And this is something that I find a lot in this book, which is, I think, the reason why I find so much passion and resonance with the Buddhist teachings, and specifically the way that Thich Nhat Hanh teaches Buddhism. And one of the ways in which this Four Nourishments, and specifically sense impressions, is taught in this book is with the analogy of the type of seeds that we're planting and watering. And basically what can also be pointed at here is that we all have the capacity to grow wholesome seeds or unwholesome seeds. And depending on what we're consuming and what we are allowing through our senses, that is going to become the food that is watering the different seeds that we have within us. So if I'm constantly watching things that are talking about violence and conflict and separation, then that is the food that I'm actually feeding the seeds that are eventually going to grow and that eventually are going to give me the fruit that is going to keep planting those seeds. So this food is asking us to be extremely and radical honest about the things that we're consuming and noticing how they are leaving an impression in our awareness and how that is directing our attention to different things around us. And what we have learned from science is that the brain is an energy efficient organ. What this means is that basically there's many different connections that the brain has already created, right? So there's neural pathways that are constantly firing. And those neural pathways have been created based on our daily habits, for example, the things that are very familiar. And when we're constantly watching the news or when we're scrolling on social media, all of these habits are creating neural pathways in our brain. And if we want to break from this constant habit, and if we want to change this habit, and in other words, we want to install or create new neural pathways, that is going to require energy. So we are going to need a lot more energy to rewrite this programming that we have set up in our brain, basically. So bringing awareness to the things that we're doing on a daily basis and how they're impacting us in all different aspects of our lives, physiologically, emotionally, and mentally, is the invitation of this nourishment. And this, of course, like all the other foods that we are going to be talking about in this video, are pointing us towards what epigenetics is talking about, right? So the lifestyle that we're sustaining, the environment. So if I'm constantly watching the news or consuming things on social media that are reminding me of all the things that are wrong in the world, that is basically what my brain is going to believe the environment is. And I am not talking about ignoring what is happening. I'm not talking about bypassing difficult emotions. I am just talking about the balance and the amount of information that we're actually consuming on a daily basis. It is completely different to give ourselves 5 to 20 minutes a day to inform ourselves as to what is happening and maybe even think about how we can help versus constantly scrolling on social media for hours and feeding ourselves of this constant conflict every 10 minutes, every 30 minutes of our day. That is simply just going to set up a foundation for our brain to believe that we are living in an environment that is in constant conflict. And that is basically how that information is going to inform our genes to switch on or off. Now, the third food of the four nourishments is volition, also intention. What is feeding our intentions? What is feeding our actions? This one I find is kind of simple, but incredibly deep. I think that with this food, the reflection really is on, am I allowing my intentions to be ego-driven, or do they have a more wholesome approach? The concept of ego is one that we can talk about, or that I can talk about for a long time. So I am not even going to go into that right now. But ego is basically the personality that is allowing this incarnation to understand that it has an identity. And that self of identity is actually creating a sense of separation with everyone else around me. And when I see myself as separate, then my default, if I am not conscious of this, and if I'm not conscious of the existence of ego, or if I'm not familiar with my personality and my tendencies, then my default is going to be driven by benefiting my personality or myself instead of thinking about everyone else when I set intentions. So one of the ways in which I really like to think about intentions and to recognize whether they are more wholesome is to really reflect on whether I am thinking just about a personal benefit or a personal gain and not thinking how that is going to affect others. So this idea of wholesome or unwholesome goes back to what I mentioned before with the analogy of the seeds that we're watering. And I think I would like to share a personal experience that can make this a little bit more practical. This, of course, is going to manifest in many different ways, depending on the context, depending on who you are, depending on your lifestyle, and so on. But for me, one of the reflections that I had in which I had to really think about what was driving my intention was when I had this goal or this aspiration to have a bigger house. And this happened a couple years ago when I had a design studio. So basically, 80% of my waking life was spent outside of my house. Yet I still had this goal to have a different, bigger house. And when I started to make these changes in my life and I actually got rid of my studio and I was able to spend more time in my current house, I realized that I really loved my house and that I just was not able to experience it before. And I started to reflect on why did I want a bigger house? Now that I was in my house, I was actually noticing how much time it took to clean, how much time it took to take care of it. And thinking about having a bigger house made me think, well, do I want to clean even more? Or do I even want to have someone help me clean? And why do I even want this if I am so happy here, right? And this, of course, we can get into the topic of aspiration and desires and intentions and goals. And maybe at some point I will have a video about that. But in this specific topic, what I realized is that I had unconsciously agreed upon this idea that we have in our modern culture, that basically one of the evidence that we have as adults that we are growing or that we are successful is that basically the place where I live reflects my level of success or my level of accomplishment in my life. And what I realized is that I was basically setting an intention or trying to water seeds that were not even mine. So basically, I was watering someone else's garden, someone else's idea, someone else's intention, hoping that my own garden grew. And I think that this was an incredible insight for me and finding when I started to reflect on what was truly driving my intentions and my goals. So volition is one of the four nourishments that is asking us to be radically honest with ourselves. And it takes a lot of reflection. It takes a lot of understanding our own programmings and our own unconscious agreements to recognize the truth behind what's feeding our intentions. Lastly, we have the fourth food of these nutriments, which is the food of consciousness. And the food of consciousness is talking about what we are feeding our mind, what we are feeding our consciousness with. So what type of thoughts are we sustaining? What type of emotions are we constantly dwelling on? What type of experiences are we having that are leaving an imprint in our mind and our consciousness? So this is how you can start to see how all of them overlap. So sense impressions, for example, if I am, like I mentioned before, watching the news and I'm literally fearing for my life because of the type of media that I'm consuming, then that is the food that we're allowing in our consciousness, because that is going to create a thought pattern of fear. That is going to create beliefs that are going to constantly drive my attention towards somewhere that is not wholesome. And I think this is a great place to talk about how mindfulness can be an incredible practice to help us reflect on how we are actually nourishing ourselves or actually consuming what could be considered as toxic, right? Because mindfulness is going to invite us to be in this present moment, to pause for a second, to stop that habit energy that is constantly moving us towards those familiar patterns that are not necessarily beneficial for ourselves. And that can be applied to the foods that we're eating. Before we make a choice, can we pause for a second? Can we be mindful and think about how that food that we're about to ingest is going to affect us? Is it going to give us energy? It's really in alignment with what my body needs and wants right now. Is it actually taking care of myself? Same thing with sense impressions. It's asking us to pause for a second when we are scrolling on social media and when we're reading the comments that are usually negative. I'm obviously saying this because I do this myself. So the moment that I am mindful, I can pause for a second and I can ask myself, how is this impacting my life? Is this actually beneficial, or is this creating more suffering for myself and others? Same thing with intentions, right? Is really asking us to take our time to think about the reason why we are going after a goal, the reason why we want something, the reason why we have certain aspirations, the reason why we want to connect with certain people. Before the action, we have the intention. So it's really asking us to think about before we act and to really reflect on whether that is wholesome or is coming from a wholesome place or an unwholesome place. And all of this is, of course, going to leave us with the content that we are allowing in our consciousness. And ultimately, mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness meditation is the practice of getting familiar with ourselves, with our thoughts, with our emotions, so that we can see them firsthand and understand them. And when we get familiar with them, and when we are aware of what type of thoughts I'm constantly thinking about, then we can have a moment of pause and set an intention now that actually drives us towards what we want. And for myself, this is pointing towards an alignment. I want to be in alignment with what is truly authentic to myself and what is truly creating well-being in my life. So I really hope that you got something out of this video. Because I want to keep recording this and I want to keep sharing this, if you leave any comments, any likes, if you interact with this video in any way, if you share it to someone, that is going to help me and the channel to be shared with others. And ultimately, because I know how much all of these practices and all of these reflections have helped me, I really hope that others can start doing that. Of course, this is not for everyone. Of course, I don't think this is the only way, but these are all ways in which I have personally found a lot of growth and room for transformation. I will see you in the next video.